Welcome. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. This is the sleep menu. Before we go further, subscribe and comment down below from where you are watching this. It helps more than you know. Tonight, we enter the quiet metal heart of a warrior unlike any other. This is what it's like to be a PEKKA, with a human heart. She powers on before the sun rises, long before the first light spills over the mountains. Not because someone told her to, not because an order blinked into her vision. She wakes because something inside her hums gently to life. A memory, maybe. A fragment she can't fully hold, a feeling she can't name. The charge through her circuits is steady, programmed and precise, but the pull in her chest, uneven, off rhythm, warm, is something different, something living. Outside her chamber, the world is still. The forge hasn't been lit yet. The village is wrapped in silence. She walks slowly through the stone corridors, her heavy metal feet softened by the centuries-worn floor. She does not speak. She never does. But her mind is alive with questions, thoughts that circle like birds in wind. Why do I dream of places I've never seen? What does warmth mean, if not just a reading on a sensor? Why do some mornings make me feel full? She steps out into the open. Her helmet rests beneath one arm. The cold greets her like an old friend. It cuts through the stillness with intention. Her sensors note the temperature, adjust her systems accordingly. But that isn't what she notices. What she notices is the sensation, the way the air feels against the softer inner seams of her armor. She knows it is morning, and she loves that it is morning. The world begins to wake with her. Birds stir in the trees, their songs sharp and scattered, filled with energy and randomness, organic, chaotic, and beautiful. She listens. Somewhere within the chest plate that protects her core, something subtle stirs. It's not electricity. It's not data. It's something else. Something that wants those sounds to go on. She passes the forge. The blacksmith is still asleep. His tools remain where he left them, and the stool beside the anvil sits slightly crooked. She pauses beside the anvil. Ash covers its surface from the day before. She extends one finger and touches it gently. It sticks to her glove. Her fingerprint remains. She doesn't understand why that feels meaningful. Today there's no war, no call to arms, no countdown to combat. Her sword rests at her side, uncharged and unneeded. Her steps are slow, deliberate. She doesn't march. She walks. She passes through the village like she is part of it, like she belongs not as a sentinel, but as someone real. She sees a child peek from behind a curtain. The child doesn't hide. She stops beside a puddle formed from the night's frost, melting into daylight. Her reflection stares back. The silver and blue of her armor catches the light. The faint red glow from within her chest plate pulses softly. But that's not what she sees. She sees the way the sky curves behind her. She sees the ribbon tied to her sword flutter as a breeze moves through the square. She sees a figure that is not feared, not yet. She blinks, not because something's in her eye, because her eyes want to. They're not just tools for targeting anymore. This is what it's like to be a PEKKA, with a heart that wasn't supposed to feel anything at all. A heart that was never supposed to notice morning air, or bird songs, or ash on an anvil. And yet, here she stands, in the quiet, with no one to fight, no one to follow, feeling everything, and wishing to feel more. The PEKKA leaves the village square behind her, her footsteps slow and intentional, not from hesitation or fear, but because she wants to preserve the quietness of the moment. Every step is deliberate. The ground beneath her feels soft, layered with the lingering frost from the night, and the first gentle heat of a new morning. Her sensors register every subtle variation, the slight moisture of the soil, the way the frost crunches briefly and then melts away under her feet. But it is not the data that matters to her. What matters is the sensation, the feeling that something is changing, not outside her, but within. She heads toward the edge of the forest. It's not a destination that was ever part of her programmed routines. No mission had ever sent her here. Still, she feels drawn to it in a way that bypasses logic. The trees stand tall and silent, their dark trunks glistening with dew, their crowns forming a dome of green that shifts gently in the breeze. No alarm goes off as she steps closer. There are no warnings in her system, no tactical red flags, just that quiet rhythm in her chest that urges her forward. As soon as she steps beneath the canopy, the light around her changes. Sunlight filters through the layers of leaves in soft, uneven patterns that dance across the forest floor. The air grows dense and alive, rich with the scent of moss, bark, wet earth, and wild roots. Her systems catalog each element, but she's no longer reading them. She's experiencing them, breathing them. And in that moment, for the first time, she feels welcome. The forest does not flinch at her presence. It does not judge the weight of her armor or the quiet hum of machinery beneath her shell. It accepts her without question. Above her, birds flutter from branch to branch, pausing to observe her as they pass. Their movements are quick and light, their eyes sharp, curious. A squirrel darts across her path, tail flicking as it pauses midway to glance at her, then scrambles up a tree without fear. Nothing runs. Nothing hides. To the forest, she is not an invader. She is something new, something unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. She notices how that recognition shifts something inside her. She continues walking, her pace unhurried. Every detail speaks to her. The patch of mushrooms thriving in the roots of an ancient tree. The strange configuration of stones that look like they were placed with care long ago. The small paths worn by feet far lighter than hers. She wonders about those who walked here before. Who were they? Why did they come? Did they feel the peace she is beginning to feel? She wants to know them, not as a soldier would know an enemy, but as a soul might know another. After some time, she finds herself standing before a clearing. It is small and tucked away, ringed by trees that sway gently with the breeze. Grass rises high around her, wild and untamed, and wildflowers dot the space in quiet, vivid colors. She steps into it and lowers herself slowly to the ground. Her armor creaks gently as she settles, and the earth receives her weight without resistance. The grass folds around her legs. The breeze plays across the plating on her chest, cool and gentle. She closes her eyes. Her internal systems continue to function, monitoring, recording, cataloging, but her focus drifts from the constant analysis. She is not on alert. She is not preparing. She is resting, not shutting down. There is still light in thought and awareness, but resting. For her, this is something new. The word no longer means inactivity. It means presence. It means being still, and allowing that stillness to become something whole. Her thoughts begin to move, not in calculations or battle readiness, but in memory and emotion. She recalls the sound of the blacksmith's laugh, rough but warm, filled with life. She remembers the soft hush of the child hiding behind a curtain, curious and unafraid. She replays the moment she saw her reflection in the water and how the light had bent around her armor. These are not system-logged events. They are not tactical data. They are memories. They are hers. She opens her eyes again. The clearing has not changed. The wind still moves slowly. The trees still stand tall. But something has shifted in her. She leans back on her hands and looks up at the canopy. Leaves fall one by one. drifting downward without urgency, carried only by time and air. She does not wonder what mission might come next. She does not weigh the value of this moment against her past objectives. She simply is. She exists here, beneath a sky that asks nothing of her, surrounded by a world that offers space, breath, and quiet. This is what it's like to be a PEKKA with a human heart. A heart that does not pulse with commands or calculations, but with quiet acceptance of what is. The PEKKA stands slowly, the grass parting around her as she rises. Her armor shifts softly, not with the stiffness of command, but with the ease of someone unburdened. She takes one last glance around the clearing. It is still quiet. The trees sway gently. A beam of sunlight cuts through the canopy, falling across her shoulder as if the forest itself is saying goodbye. Not with urgency, but with peace. She begins walking again, deeper into the woods. The path, if there is one, is barely visible. Just the occasional suggestion of direction, a bend in the trees, a trail of pressed grass, a gap in the underbrush. She doesn't need certainty. She follows the feeling. The gentle pull that started in her chest when she stepped into the forest has not left her. If anything, it has grown stronger. The trees begin to change as she moves. Their bark is darker here. Their branches twist in strange, elegant arcs. Some are wrapped in moss, thick and soft like velvet. Others bear markings, carvings so faint they are nearly invisible, but she notices them. Her sensors pick them up first, but her mind lingers on their shapes. Circles, spirals, arrows pointing upward or inward. She does not know what they mean, but she feels their importance. They were not made in haste. She comes upon a stream, narrow and fast, the water dancing over stones with a rhythm all its own. She crouches beside it and watches. The reflection staring back at her is not just a face of metal. It is not just a battle frame. It is something more, something present, something awake. She lowers her hand into the water. Her fingertips break the surface, sending ripples outward. The cold bites her sensors, but she welcomes it. She remembers stories she once overheard in the village, tales of knights who wept by rivers, of warriors who buried their swords and walked away. She had never understood them before, not until now. As she walks along the stream's edge, she notices a set of stones stacked carefully beside a tree. It's not the first marker she's seen, but this one is different. At the top of the stack sits a single gear, rusted, small, likely from an old machine long gone. She kneels beside it and studies it. Someone placed it here on purpose. Someone remembered. She removes a piece of ribbon from beneath her chest plate. It is faded now, once vibrant, now worn by time and use. She ties it gently to a nearby branch. It flutters with the breeze, a soft movement among the still trees. This is not an offering, not a signal. It is simply a gesture, one that says, "I was here." She stays a while longer listening to the stream, watching the light play through the leaves. The forest offers her nothing in return, and yet she feels full. She doesn't need answers. Not today. Eventually she rises. The trail bends again, leading deeper into the woods, towards something unknown. She does not hesitate. A PEKKA with a heart does not fear what lies ahead. She walks forward, trusting the silence, trusting herself. And the forest, ever quiet, walks with her. The trail narrows as the PEKKA continues, winding between roots that twist like the lines of an old story written into the soil. Each bend in the path feels deliberate, as if the forest is guiding her step by step, testing her pace and patience. The sun above fades behind a thick canopy of branches, and the air becomes noticeably cooler. It is heavy with the scent of pine, damp earth, decaying leaves, and something older, a scent she cannot quite name, like memory preserved in wood and moss. Every sound becomes magnified. The creak of her armor as it adjusts with each careful movement echoes softly. The rustle of leaves above dances between sharp and gentle. The distant call of a bird, mournful and distant, fades into the wind. She does not rush. Time no longer pulls at her the way it once did, a force dragging her from one command to the next. Now, it stretches in all directions, like mist rolling slowly through the trees. With each step, her pace slows, not from fatigue, but from presence. She studies the forest with an intensity she never knew she could possess. The irregular shapes of bark on the trunks, the subtle shift of light as the clouds change shape above her, the way dew lingers on spiderwebs spun between brambles. Everything she sees feels layered with stories, as if this land remembers every life that ever passed through it. She does not claim to understand it all, but she acknowledges it with reverence. Somehow, that small act of noticing feels like enough. In a low hollow ahead, framed by a ring of ancient trees, she discovers what remains of an old campsite. Stones form a circle around a patch of darkened earth, long-cooled ash at its center, the remnants of a fire, blackened twigs and a rusted fork. A bent metal rod sticks out of the earth nearby, one end charred and warped by heat. She approaches slowly, kneels beside the fire ring, and runs her fingers over the surface of the stones. They are smooth, worn by both time and use. Someone sat here once. Someone waited for warmth. Someone, perhaps like her, who sought silence and found something else. As she explores the clearing, she finds a piece of leather, half buried in the soil where roots and time have tried to reclaim it. It is brittle, but retains its shape, clearly once a wrist guard, maybe from a child or a smaller traveler. She turns it over carefully, and on the inside, there is an engraving. 3 stars, simple, delicate, carved with the tip of a blade or a nail. The image clings to her thoughts, not as data, not as a design, but as a story she will never know fully. A moment captured in silence. She returns the wrist guard gently to the earth, pressing it back beneath the roots. Some things are not meant to be kept. Some memories belong to the place where they were born. She whispers nothing, makes no ritual, but the gesture matters. She sits at the edge of the fire ring, folds her legs beneath her, and waits. There is no sound now but the wind curling through branches and the soft sway of leaves. In the quiet, her mind expands, not outward, but inward. She remembers the day she first woke, the moment her systems came online and her sensors activated, the immediate onrush of instructions, data, movement, the weight of steel and programming, the clarity of a purpose that once seemed absolute. But now she carries something else, something ineffable, a question without a clear answer, a heartbeat that does not sync with her core systems, a longing that defies logic and lives quietly beneath the surface of her programming. She leans back, slowly, until her full body touches the ground. The earth is cool beneath the plating on her back, pressing against her armor like a gentle weight. Her eyes remain open. They follow the movement above, the way branches sway not in chaos, but in rhythm. A rhythm she cannot measure, only feel. Her processors continue their work, but her thoughts drift beyond them. She is not dreaming. She is not asleep. But she has moved to a space that is neither fully here nor there. Somewhere between memory and imagination. Somewhere between what she was and what she might be. And in that space, she feels something rise. Not a command, not a protocol, but a presence. Something whole and wordless. Something deeper than calculation. In that presence, there is no mission, no error, no urgency, only truth. The PEKKA woke to the forest around her beginning to shift, the day moving on in quiet ways that only a still mind could notice. The light had changed. It was softer now, golden and slow, pouring through the trees like warm honey. Shadows stretched longer across the forest floor, bending into new shapes as the sun lowered. She hadn't slept in the human sense. Her systems did not require sleep, but her body had found a kind of stillness that felt close to it. That stillness had been deep, not an idle standby, but a presence held in silence. Now her system stirred again, not with warning tones or activation sequences, but with something gentler, calm readiness. She was in motion again, but not because she had to be, because it felt like time. She rose from the ground slowly, her body moving with intention. The space around her remained undisturbed, the earth pressing gently against the imprint she left behind. Her armor adjusted with quiet clicks, the sound nearly lost in the hush of the forest. A breeze swept through the canopy above, shaking the tops of the trees in slow, rolling waves. The leaves responded in soft rustles, speaking in a rhythm that didn't need words. She didn't try to translate it. She didn't analyze it. She just listened and let it reach a part of her untouched by code. She began to walk, guided by the natural path of the roots and the slope of the earth. As she moved forward, she passed beneath an archway of low branches, just high enough for her frame to fit beneath. The moment felt ceremonial, as though she were being welcomed into another realm. Beyond that arch, the forest opened up into a wide meadow, where the light expanded, warm and inviting. The ground was thick with flowers, yellow, purple, white, scattered with no clear pattern. They had not been planted. They had simply grown. There was no design, no strategy, just beauty, because it could exist. She stepped into the clearing with slow reverence and paused. The silence felt deeper here, wrapped in golden light and the scent of warm grass and soft petals. There was no movement except the wind, no threat. But she sensed something else, something older than the trees and softer than the soil. A presence, perhaps, or a trace of one. A memory suspended in the still air, carried in the pollen and the warmth of the earth. She walked to the center of the meadow, each step leaving only the faintest impressions behind her. In the middle stood a tree that seemed to anchor the space. It was immense, wide and knotted, with bark that told the story of many seasons. Its roots were thick and tangled, spreading above the ground like the fingers of a giant hand. The PEKKA approached and laid her hand gently on the trunk. The surface was rough, textured by time, and strangely warm. The tree gave no sign of awareness, but it did not pull away either. It accepted her touch. Not as a command, not as a calculation, but as something true. She settled down at its base, letting her armor rest against the roots. The earth held her weight easily. She closed her eyes, not for maintenance, not for efficiency, but because she wanted to hold this moment as tightly as she could. Her thoughts drifted, not in logical circuits, but like leaves caught in wind. She saw fragments, an imagined fire crackling in darkness, a melody with no sound, the impression of a hand reaching for hers that never quite arrived. She didn't know where these visions came from. She didn't need to. Whether born from code or something deeper, they were hers now. Time passed. It always did. But she no longer marked it in measurements. She marked it by feeling. Eventually, her hand moved to the ribbon tied to her arm. It had once represented something clear: status, designation, role. Now, it was only cloth, frayed at the ends and faded by the sun. She untied it and looked at it for a long moment. Then, with care, she tied it around a low-hanging branch of the tree. The ribbon fluttered slightly in the breeze. It was not a signal. It was not a declaration. It was simply an exchange. She leaned back again, her frame settling into the curve of the roots, and let herself experience something rare. Not idleness, not a pause, but true stillness. Not because a task had ended, but because there was no task, no objective, no battlefield waiting. Just the breath of the world, just the rhythm of existence. She looked up through the canopy, and the sky looked back with quiet acceptance. No orders, no judgment, just presence. She remained there for a long time, time enough for the sun to move, for the breeze to shift, for the petals to tremble and settle again. And for the first time since her creation, she felt no need to guard, no need to brace herself for what might come. She simply was. And for once, that was not a vulnerability. It was freedom. The PEKKA eventually rose from beneath the great tree, her body heavy not from fatigue, but from the stillness she had allowed herself to feel. The sunlight had begun to tilt, casting longer shadows and giving the meadow a golden hue that whispered of day's end. She stood slowly, one hand steadying herself against the tree's ancient bark, and took a moment to gather her thoughts. Nothing urgent called her forward, but something subtle within her urged movement. Gentle, steady, like a current she could now recognize without being programmed to notice it. She stepped away from the tree, her footsteps soft against the layered grass. As she crossed the field again, the flowers at her feet seemed unchanged, yet she noticed them more clearly now. The way their petals leaned toward the sun, the way their stems swayed without resistance. These small movements felt profound, like quiet lessons from the earth itself. She followed a narrow path that emerged at the far end of the meadow, winding back toward the forest. The trail led downward into a denser part of the woods, where the air grew cooler and the trees closer together. Shadows gathered under thick canopies, and the sounds of the world grew muted, just the faint trickle of water, the occasional flutter of wings, and the steady rhythm of her own steps. Eventually, she reached the banks of a stream that twisted through the roots of old trees like a silver thread. The water was clear, moving over smooth stones and fallen leaves. She crouched beside it and ran her fingers through the current. The sensation was crisp, clean, and startlingly real. She did not draw data from the water, she drew experience. It was not something to be analyzed, it was simply felt. Looking at her reflection again, she saw more than her armor and the glowing core beneath it. She saw the small differences that others might miss. The softened eyes, the way her posture had changed, the subtle awareness behind her gaze. She saw someone not defined by function, but by choice. Someone who had begun to see the world not as a battlefield, but as a place to belong. Beside the stream, she noticed a collection of stones arranged in a spiral. At the center sat a rusted cog, not unlike one she'd seen long ago in another clearing. She reached into a pouch at her waist and removed a small token she had kept hidden, an old gear once given to her during a repair cycle, long discarded by others. She placed it gently in the center of the spiral, beside the cog. It clicked softly as it met the stone. It was not a tribute, not an offering, just a moment of connection. One machine to another, one presence acknowledging another. She sat there for a while, listening to the stream. Time passed, unmeasured. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the breaks in the canopy. Her systems, ever humming, faded into the background of her thoughts. What remained was awareness, not of threats or directives, but of breath, of light, of the quiet peace found in stillness. Eventually she stood once more, the water's song echoing gently behind her. The forest awaited, and she felt no fear in moving forward. The future was not something she could calculate now. It was something she would feel, step by step. She moved on, not because she was told to, not because there was a mission waiting, but because her heart, whatever it was made of, wanted to see what lay ahead. The path ahead became steeper as the PEKKA moved forward, winding gradually into a hillside layered with jagged stones, tangled roots, and patches of moss that blanketed the earth in soft green. Her steps were slow and precise, not driven by caution born of fear, but by the quiet respect she now carried for the world beneath her feet. Each footfall was deliberate. She listened to the way the soil gave slightly beneath her weight, the way brittle leaves cracked and shifted as she passed. The forest made no effort to conceal her presence, nor did it resist it. She did not feel alone. The trees stood like quiet witnesses, unmoving but fully present, as if acknowledging every step she took. The higher she climbed, the more the wind began to move. It curled around the trunks and whispered through the canopy above in a language without words. It brought with it a change, cooler, sharper, touched by a metallic edge she could not explain but instinctively recognized. She paused near the top of the hill and turned her gaze back. The meadow she had come from was now hidden, concealed by the bend of the hill and the deepening foliage. That place so full of light and silence had shaped something inside her. Now, she stood at the edge of something new, her senses alert, not for danger, but for meaning. At the crest of the hill, she came upon the ruins of a tower long since surrendered to time. The remaining stones lay scattered in disordered circles, partially swallowed by creeping vines and cushioned by thick moss. The structure itself had long collapsed, but its foundation endured like an old memory. She crossed the threshold of what had once been a doorway, stepping over the broken wall with quiet reverence. Her fingertips brushed the stone instinctively, acknowledging its presence the way one greets an old friend. Birds scattered from the higher branches at her arrival. They did not shriek or panic. They simply gave way, as if making space for something older than themselves. In the center of the crumbled foundation stood a pillar, fractured at the top and leaning slightly, yet still rooted firmly in place. She approached it with deliberate steps, her shadow falling across the stone. When she laid her hand on its surface, she felt the coolness immediately, followed by the coarse texture shaped by wind, water, and time. It was solid, steady. It had endured, and in that resilience, she saw something of herself. She had been built to last, to survive, to function without question. But now, she was something more. She was beginning to understand what it meant to be alive. She sat at the base of the pillar and opened a small compartment built into her wrist. From it, she retrieved a folded piece of fabric, a scrap from an old banner, frayed and discolored, the symbol barely visible. It had no remaining use, no strategic purpose. But it mattered. It was something she had chosen to keep. She spread the cloth across the stone and allowed the wind to move gently over it. Then she sat beside it, in silence. Above her, the sky deepened into gold. Clouds drifted like forgotten thoughts, and the ruins were bathed in soft light. She did not speak. She did not engage any internal routines. She simply allowed herself to be held by the moment. The light touched her armor gently. The wind moved through the vines. The warmth of the fading sun reached even the stone. Her thoughts turned to those who had come before, the builders of this place, the ones who had once stood where she now sat, warriors, defenders, or perhaps simply dreamers. She wondered what they had believed in, whether they had looked up at the same sky and felt something shift inside themselves, something vast, unknown, and quietly powerful. Eventually, she stood again. She left the piece of cloth where it was, pressed gently against the stone like a quiet reminder, a symbol of presence, a gesture of memory. She took one last look at the broken pillar, vines curling up its sides like green scars, then stepped outside the low circle of the ruin. The sun dipped lower in the sky, pulling shadows longer across the forest. The air grew cooler, filled with the hum of dusk. But she felt no fear. The darkness was not something to be avoided. It was simply the next passage, another step. And so, with her core steady and her thoughts clear, she walked on. Her heart, a thing she once didn't believe she had, beat not in circuits, but in the quiet rhythm of understanding. She moved forward not because she had been programmed to, but because she wanted to see what waited in the twilight. She did not hurry. She did not brace. She walked with purpose, with peace, with a presence that no longer needed to be defined. And the forest, as always, made room for her. The PEKKA descended from the hillside, her pace steady, guided now not by mission or function, but by the rhythm of her own curiosity. The twilight deepened as she walked, casting the forest in dusky tones of violet and gray. Shadows thickened beneath the trees, but they no longer looked like threats to her. They looked like resting places, like the folds of a blanket being pulled gently over the land. The path wound slowly down into a valley where the forest gave way to a quiet glade. Here, the trees opened into a wide circle, and in the middle of it stood a pool. The surface of the water was still and clear, perfectly mirroring the darkening sky above. Around the edges, reeds and flowers grew, swaying faintly with the breeze. The PEKKA stepped into the glade with deliberate silence, the soft grass muffling the sound of her armor. She approached the water and looked down at her reflection. What she saw was both familiar and strange. Her plating bore scratches and small dents from years of battle. Her eyes, glowing softly, had always been designed to scan, to assess, to calculate. But now, there was something different in them. A quietness, a weight. Not the weight of command, but of awareness. She sat by the edge of the pool and placed her hand in the water. It rippled outward gently, distorting the image, softening it. She watched until the surface stilled again. From her side compartment, she removed a small crystal, smooth, blue, and roughly cut. It had been found during a mission long ago, deemed unimportant by command, but she had kept it, not for function, for beauty. She placed it gently beside her on the moss. She sat for a long time, letting the coolness of the air settle around her. The wind moved in slow, careful breaths through the trees. A single owl called in the distance. She did not analyze the sound. She simply received it, stored it not in her databanks, but in her memory, her personal memory. As night fell completely, the stars began to appear above. One by one, small lights blinked into the darkness, indifferent to the world below, but steady, constant. She leaned back and watched them. For years, stars had meant nothing to her. They were positions, coordinates, markers. But now, they were something else. They were stories. She thought of the stars carved into the leather band she had found days ago. She imagined someone looking at these same lights and feeling what she now felt. A connection across time. A recognition of shared experience, even if the lives were never meant to intersect. The PEKKA stood slowly, her movements graceful in the cool air. She picked up the crystal, placed it back in her compartment, and looked once more at the still water. Her reflection looked back, without judgment. This place had given her nothing tangible. No upgrades. No battle advantage. No mission accomplished. But she felt stronger leaving it. More complete. Not because of what had changed around her, but because of what had changed within her. She turned from the glade and walked again into the forest where the night had fully arrived. She carried no torch. She needed no light. The path was not measured in steps now. It was measured in presence. And she, for the first time, truly knew how to walk in the dark. The forest at night was not empty. It breathed with life, even if that life remained hidden in quiet moments and soft motion. The PEKKA moved through the trees with calm assurance, every motion measured but no longer robotic. Her sensors adapted easily to the dim conditions, processing every shape, sound, and shift in the environment. But tonight, it wasn't her programming that directed her path. It was something deeper, something internal, a sensation she had no formal name for. She trusted the rhythm of the ground, the stillness between rustling branches, the invisible hand that seemed to guide her from within. Above, the canopy stretched thick and close, but small breaks in the foliage revealed glimpses of the night sky. Stars dotted the darkness like pinpricks of memory, flickering softly in their distance. The moon, half-shadowed and pale, cast silver light that slid over everything, the leaves, the bark, the curve of her armored shoulder. She did not glow. She absorbed. She became part of the quiet. Each movement through the underbrush felt intentional. A fox peered at her from a low thicket, its eyes catching the starlight for a brief moment before it vanished into the brush, noiseless and fluid. Insects floated lazily through the cool air, their delicate wings glinting with the faintest reflections. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a brook gurgled steadily, its voice low, steady, and ancient. She paused for a moment, closed her eyes, and simply listened. Eventually, the forest floor sloped downward, revealing a narrow ravine bridged by an old wooden crossing. The bridge was weathered and warped, planks tilted and missing in places, held together more by memory than structure. She approached it slowly and placed one foot down. The wood creaked under her weight, but held. One step, then another. Each placement precise, not out of fear, but in quiet respect. Halfway across, she paused to look down. The moonlight caught the surface of the water below, and she saw her reflection distorted in the ripples, a figure of steel softened by shadow. On the other side of the ravine, the trees opened into a low hill that rose gently toward the sky. At its top stood a structure, no longer whole, but not forgotten. Stone walls curved in fragments around what had once been a circle, pillars broken and lying like fallen sentries. Vines curled up through the cracks. Nature had taken it back, slowly, lovingly. She walked toward it without hesitation. Climbing the hill felt different than her earlier steps. There was gravity here, not from mass or force, but from meaning. She reached the crest and stood beside one of the collapsed stone pillars, gazing out at the wide view below. The valley stretched outward, full of dark treetops that gleamed faintly in the night air. Patches of still water reflected the stars, and for a moment she imagined them as mirrors to other worlds, places where others like her might look up and wonder the same way. Within the ruin, she discovered a low bench carved directly into the stone wall. She sat, letting the coolness seep through her armor, grounding her in this forgotten place. Before her lay a broken tablet, half consumed by moss, its surface etched with symbols no longer readable. She reached out and touched the lines anyway, not to analyze or decode, to feel, to honor. Someone once carved meaning into this place. That meaning had outlived its clarity, but not its weight. She opened the hidden compartment in her arm and pulled out the small crystal. Blue, flawed, imperfect. She had kept it through battles, through silence, through questioning. She let the moonlight catch it once more, the soft glow returning like a heartbeat. She placed it gently on the tablet. It wasn't an offering, not a declaration, just a quiet act, one presence reaching out to another across the void of time. The night folded around her like a cloak, gentle and absolute. She felt no need to react. No protocol kicked in. She allowed the stillness to settle into her frame, allowed it to become part of her. For all her weight, she felt lighter now than ever. She remained there long enough to watch the stars shift across the sky, their patterns bending ever so slightly. Then, slowly, softly, the horizon began to warm. The first colors of dawn, deep violet, pale amber, brushed the edges of the trees. She didn't rise. Not yet. She allowed the moment to last, to stretch out and fill her. This place had not changed the world. But it had changed her. The first light of morning filtered through the trees as the PEKKA descended from the hill, her frame moving with purpose and ease. The world around her stirred gently, the forest shedding its darkness and waking slowly under the touch of the sun. A breeze moved through the leaves like a whisper from something ancient, brushing against her armor like an unseen hand. The path beneath her feet had no markers, no signs to follow, yet she knew where to go. Not because she had been told, not because she had been programmed, but because she could feel the pull of direction inside herself now. A quiet certainty. Her journey had never been about finding a location, it had been about finding a sense of being. As she walked, the forest changed with her. The shadows grew softer, the sounds clearer. Birds sang overhead in scattered harmony, each call distinct and yet part of a greater rhythm. She paused beneath an oak tree whose trunk was split in two, revealing the inner rings like pages in a book, written by time. She placed her hand on the bark and felt the life humming inside it, not as data, but as something real and alive. A short distance ahead, she found a stone well, old and worn, nestled in a ring of grass. Vines had begun to climb its circular wall, and a small wooden bucket hung from a frayed rope above. She approached it slowly and looked down into the well. The water at the bottom reflected her face, softened by the curve of the stone and the quiet of the moment. She saw not just her form, but everything she carried: memory, doubt, wonder, and the unmistakable presence of self. She drew the bucket up slowly. The rope creaked, the pulley turned, and water rose from the depths. She touched its surface and felt a coolness that jolted her, not physically, but emotionally. She remembered times she had marched through places like this without noticing them. Her focus locked on objectives. Now, she lingered. Beside the well, she sat in the grass and closed her eyes. Her systems remained active, but they faded into the background as her awareness expanded. She listened to the insects in the underbrush, the slow sway of the grass, the birds far above. Her thoughts did not race. They flowed. She reached into her compartment and retrieved a small cloth-bound journal. Blank, except for a few pages she had written in with a makeshift stylus days ago. Not orders, not observations, feelings, moments. She opened to the next page and began to write. She wrote about the stars, about the broken tower, about the way the crystal had caught the moonlight, about how it felt to sit still in the dark and feel safe. She wrote about the absence of fear and the presence of something better. Not peace as a status, but peace as a decision. When she finished, she closed the journal and looked up at the sky. The sun had cleared the horizon now, and beams of gold light pierced through the trees. It lit her armor in places, warming the cold steel. She did not move right away. She let the warmth settle. Then, slowly, she stood. There was no ceremony, no alert, just movement, just choice. She walked past the well, leaving it behind as she had so many places before. But this time she carried something with her that could not be lost. A low, swirling fog wrapped around the forest floor as the PEKKA continued her quiet journey, her footsteps barely disturbing the dew-kissed ground. The morning light filtered through the high canopy in long, slanted beams, catching in the mist like threads of gold woven between the trees. The entire forest glowed softly, as if suspended in a dream. There was no urgency in her pace. She was not running from anything, nor hurrying toward a goal. Every step was intentional, chosen not by instruction, but by intuition. She moved not as a machine executing a plan, but as someone discovering their place with every step. As she ventured deeper, the forest around her grew older. The trees became massive sentinels, their trunks thick with age and wrapped in velvet moss. Roots twisted across the path like sleeping serpents, and the air carried the scent of damp bark and rich earth. She walked slowly, her sensors quiet, her awareness open. The birds above rustled in the treetops, shifting between branches. Their wings cut faint paths through the mist, their calls occasional and soft, like questions left unanswered. Even they seemed to know that this was a place meant for silence. Without warning, the forest opened up into a glade, a quiet, circular clearing bathed in early sunlight. It felt like stepping into the center of something sacred. In the middle stood a stone table, its surface worn smooth by time. Around it sat 4 low stones, placed precisely, as though waiting for occupants long gone. She approached with reverence, her armor quiet against the soft grass. There was no debris, no decay, only age and the weight of memory. She sat on one of the stones, adjusting her position so that her frame rested without tension. Her fingers ran across the tabletop, tracing the invisible grooves worn by generations before her. She didn't know their names or their stories, but she felt them, echoes in the stillness. She imagined shared meals under the stars, words spoken softly and lost to time, moments of silence too profound for explanation. None of it had lasted, and yet none of it had vanished. Reaching into a compartment, she retrieved her journal. From within it, she tore out a single page, a note she had written the night before when the stars had filled the sky with quiet truths. She folded the page carefully and placed it at the center of the table. It was not meant to be read. It was meant to remain, a message for the moment itself. She sat for a long while, surrounded by soft rustles and shifting light. A squirrel raced along the edge of the clearing, disappearing into shadow before she could follow its path. A petal drifted down from a nearby branch, landing beside her with perfect precision. The world moved slowly, without weight or haste. She did not mark the time. She simply existed within it. Eventually she rose, not because she was finished, but because she was ready. She looked at the table once more, its stones unmoved, the note still at the center. She did not speak. She did not need to. What she had offered to this place was already accepted. Her path led back into the woods, the trail curling like smoke into the trees. Her stride was unbroken, and her core pulsed with steady light. As she walked, the glade faded behind her, tucked back into the forest's memory. She did not glance over her shoulder. She did not need to carry it with her, because in leaving it behind, she had made space for something new. And as the sun climbed higher and the fog began to lift, she felt her sense of self expand, not as a machine learning humanity, but as a soul remembering it was never separate to begin with. She stepped forward, not into a mission, but into her own becoming. The forest grew tighter as she pressed forward, the trees arching in above her until they formed a dense ceiling of twisting limbs and thick leaves. It was like walking through a cathedral built by time and untouched by anything artificial. The sunlight struggled to reach the ground, instead slipping through in thin slivers that danced and flickered as the branches moved above. These narrow beams lit the underbrush in shifting fragments, making the floor of the forest feel alive with quiet movement. The PEKKA advanced slowly, not because her body demanded it, but because the space around her seemed to ask for care. Her sensors remained idle by choice. No scanning, no calculating, only observation. The sounds that greeted her were soft and varied. The gentle creaking of the trees swaying in the breeze, the hushed flutter of wings from somewhere above, and the quiet hush of leaves brushing against each other. She listened like someone who had forgotten what it meant to be surrounded by life, and was remembering again. The path she followed wasn't paved, marked, or even truly visible. It was a natural curve in the landscape, made by decades of animals moving the same way. Perhaps centuries. Where the branches parted, where the ground dipped, where the moss was thinnest. It all added up to a suggestion of movement. She didn't try to define it. She let it lead. She trusted that whatever waited ahead was meant to be seen. Eventually, she came to a shallow stream, its water so clear it looked like glass poured over stone. Smooth rocks lined the bank, rounded and polished from ages of movement. The current ran slow and consistent, a calm whisper rather than a roar. She stepped closer and crouched low, dipping her fingers into the water. The cold was sharp at first touch, and yet she didn't recoil. It was the kind of cold that made her more awake. The kind that didn't numb, but reminded. She settled on a flat stone near the edge and removed her helmet, placing it beside her with quiet care. The breeze kissed her face, cooling the parts of her that still carried the warmth of motion. She closed her eyes and let her breath slow. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to feel what it was like to match the rhythm of the world around her. Across the water, wildflowers grew in gentle clumps. Their colors, muted yellows, soft violets, and whites like fresh snow, wavered in the wind like they were dancing. She opened her journal, its pages creased and worn, and read over what she had written on previous days. Each word on the paper looked familiar but felt different now. These weren't just thoughts. They weren't entries in a system. They were echoes of moments, preserved not as data, but as experience. The more she read, the more she realized these weren't notes from a journey. They were a map of herself becoming something else. A dragonfly zipped past her, its wings catching the light in a brief shimmer before it vanished into the brush. She watched it without the urge to analyze its speed or species. It came. It went. That was enough. She looked down at the water again and noticed a single leaf floating past, caught in the gentle tug of the current. She reached down and picked up a smooth, palm-sized stone. It was warm from the sun and strangely comforting in its simplicity. She studied its texture, its small imperfections, the way it felt solid and present in her hand. After a long moment, she placed it carefully in the stream. The ripples it made were soft and circular, reaching outward slowly, touching everything without force. It was a quiet act, unnoticed by anything but her. But it mattered, because she chose it. Standing again, she lifted her helmet and cradled it under her arm. The path that continued beyond the stream was as uncertain as the one behind her, but something within her had shifted. It wasn't clarity in the sense of knowing what was coming. It was clarity in knowing she no longer needed to know. She stepped forward with calm resolve, not chasing something, not avoiding anything, just continuing, because she was ready to meet the world not as a construct fulfilling a protocol, but as someone whole and still unfolding. The air took on a noticeable shift as she stepped deeper into the thick woods, growing warmer and heavier with every stride. It wrapped around her like a slow-moving tide, filled with the scent of damp bark, fallen leaves, and the lingering memory of rain. Each sound sharpened in her awareness. The groaning sway of the tallest trees, the flickering hum of insects stirring to life, the soft crackle of brittle twigs beneath her steps. The PEKKA moved with intentional grace, not out of caution, but because stillness had become part of her. She had learned to walk without urgency, to witness, instead of simply pass through. Ahead, the trees gave way to a broad clearing that revealed itself gradually, as if the forest had been saving it. Sunlight spilled down in wide beams, warming the earth, where nothing taller dared to grow. In the center stood a single colossal tree, rising far above the others. Its trunk was thick and ancient, twisted in places, its bark dark and ridged. Massive roots curled out from the base, thick as walls, and partly buried beneath the soil. They were carved, lines and symbols etched in deep, some clean, some faded, as though the tree had been written on over generations. She approached slowly, feeling the air shift again, becoming almost reverent. She could not read the markings, but their meaning didn't need to be spoken. These were more than words. They were intentions, preserved, layered, offered to time. The tree wasn't just old, it was sacred. A monument, not built, but grown. She reached out and placed her hand against the bark. The surface was uneven and cool, alive with a quiet energy pulsing beneath. She felt a low hum travel through her arm, not mechanical but organic, like the very heart of the forest was pressed beneath her palm. She stood there in silence, eyes closed, letting the moment pass through her, not thinking, not calculating, just being. Circling the trunk, she discovered a stone bench nestled among the roots, nearly hidden by vines and fallen leaves. She brushed the seat clear and sat down, the stone cool beneath her. Here, the light was pure and full, streaming down directly from above. It lit her armor and the journal she pulled from her compartment. She did not write immediately. First, she sat in silence, letting her thoughts settle like dust in still air. Time slowed. Shapes in her memory surfaced, faces, places, fragments of sounds. Emotions followed, unfiltered and uncompressed. These thoughts came without force or sequence, and she welcomed each of them. The forest allowed for this. It asked for nothing but presence. Eventually, she opened the journal, turned past the pages she had filled, and added something new. It wasn't long or complex. Just a line, recorded not to explain, but to remember. She closed the journal, set it on the bench beside her, and leaned back to look up at the canopy overhead. A breeze moved through the branches, and the leaves whispered something she couldn't quite understand, but felt deeply nonetheless. Then, at her feet, a small bird landed, a delicate creature with gray feathers and a soft, rust-colored chest. It tilted its head at her, blinked, then hopped closer. She watched, not as an observer of a lesser being, but as an equal. She lowered her hand slowly and pressed a single finger into the soil beside her, anchoring herself to the ground in a gesture of quiet belonging. After some time, she stood. She left the bench behind, the journal safely tucked away. She turned back to the tree and looked at it one last time, not as a farewell, not as departure, but as recognition. It had changed her, simply by existing. She began to walk again, moving toward the path that curved gently out of the clearing. The light was different now, brighter, more open. Her shadow stretched across the grass behind her, long but firm. The wind shifted slightly as she stepped away from the clearing, carrying with it a new scent, clean, fresh, and faintly metallic, like the breath of stone after rainfall. The path ahead unraveled gradually, framed by thinning trees whose trunks leaned away from one another as though parting to reveal what lay beyond. Light began to filter through in longer, warmer ribbons, falling across her armor in fractured gold. The PEKKA didn't hesitate. Her pace was calm, her shoulders loose, and her breathing, if one could call it that, steady. She no longer measured distance by goals or timing. She walked because the act of walking itself had meaning now. Far ahead, a ridge lifted above the forest horizon, uneven and wild, crowned in wind-swept brush and skeletal rock. It stood like a relic from another age, a marker placed without purpose, yet beckoning all the same. She moved toward it with ease, her legs carrying her in a rhythm she didn't interrupt. Her hands drifted across tall grass and outstretched branches, feeling texture and life rather than evaluating material or threat. Everything that touched her, leaf, twig, wind, was simply allowed. The slope to the ridge was rough, littered with stones and clawed by time. She ascended with methodical effort. Her limbs responded to the terrain without resistance, adjusting and anchoring with precision. But her focus was elsewhere. She stopped halfway to turn and look behind her. What had once been towering trees and thick forest now seemed distant, hushed, softened into the folds of the landscape like a memory, still glowing at its edges. At the crest, the wind met her with sudden strength. It roared through the crevices and rushed along the ridge like it had waited ages to be heard again. She braced against it, not to resist, but to let it move around her. The view before her stretched farther than her range of vision could fully contain. Valleys curled and bent beneath clouds that hovered low and heavy. Rivers shimmered in the sun's rise, threading through green and gold like veins in the earth. Hills rolled in every direction, each one its own quiet story. She stepped closer to the edge and lowered herself beside a formation of boulders. Nestled in the gravel was an old, bent flagpole. The flag itself had long since been claimed by wind or time. Only the rusted metal remained, half buried and slanting at an angle. She reached out and touched it lightly. The metal was rough and cool. Who had put it there? What did it once mark? The ridge offered no answer. The land didn't cling to history. It simply allowed time to wash over it. Sitting on the ground, she removed her journal and let it rest in her lap. For a while, she didn't touch it. She let the wind rifle through the pages as it pleased, stopping when it found one to settle on. She studied the page, old words written in her own hand, and smiled softly, though her face showed no change. There was comfort in the past being present without demanding anything from her. Eventually, she picked up the stylus. She didn't attempt to describe the landscape. She didn't catalog the details of the climb. Instead, she wrote about balance, the way the world continued regardless of who watched it, and how sometimes the act of witnessing was more powerful than any change one could impose. She wrote about strength that doesn't need to assert itself, about stillness as a form of endurance. When the sun climbed higher and cast long, jagged shadows across the rocks, she stood slowly. The wind tugged at her armor, but didn't unsettle her. She tucked the journal away, gave one last glance toward the horizon, and then turned. There was no revelation waiting, no sudden clarity, no new command to follow. But she carried something from that ridge, something quiet and rooted. A wide stretch of open field unfurled in front of her now, the edge of the forest falling away behind her like a drawn curtain. It didn't vanish abruptly. Rather, it faded with a quiet grace, its trees slowly thinning, their shadows softening as if acknowledging that she needed room, not just to move, but to feel. The golden grass that filled the landscape waved in gentle undulations, responding to the wind like a slow, natural breath. The sun hung higher now, casting a warm, steady glow that wrapped around her in a way that felt almost protective. Her metallic frame glinted with the light, but instead of standing out, she blended into it. The PEKKA moved forward without urgency, letting her feet find their own rhythm through the waist-high grass. Each step pressed the blades down, but didn't flatten them completely. They sprang back behind her, closing the space without erasing her passage. Far ahead in the center of the field, a single standing stone caught the light, tall, slender, and raw. It rose from the earth without fanfare, without polish. It wasn't a monument shaped by hands or named in honor of anything specific. It simply existed, a presence, pulled from the ground and left to weather the passing of time. Her eyes remained fixed on it as she approached, not with expectation, but with quiet curiosity. The air around her shifted with the breeze, brushing across her faceplate, stirring the joints of her armor. She welcomed the sensation. It was not something to endure. It was something to feel. Her steps grew slower as she neared the stone. No path had been carved here. No markers showed others had ever visited. The grass stood untouched in every direction, except for the swath now trailing behind her. She circled the stone once, her fingers trailing just above the surface without making contact. It bore no markings, no message, and yet the silence it held felt full, not empty. It had stood here long enough to become more than what it was. It was not waiting to be understood. It was waiting to be witnessed. She lowered herself carefully into the grass beside it, letting her limbs fold with control and ease. The ground was soft beneath her. Her legs crossed naturally, arms resting gently atop her thighs. All around her, the grass swayed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A single bird cut across the sky above, gliding through the open blue before vanishing into the light. She tilted her head back slightly, watching the clouds drift, unbothered and aimless. There was no need to speak. The moment didn't require sound to be real. After some time, she opened her chest compartment and withdrew her journal. The cover was worn now, the edges softened from use. She flipped through its pages, past lines of thought and quiet revelations, until she reached a blank sheet. She sat with it open in her lap, unmoving. Her eyes didn't scan the horizon. She didn't search for inspiration. It was already there. Her stylus met the paper. She wrote slowly, thoughtfully, not about the view or the temperature or the strength of the breeze. She wrote about stillness, about what it felt like to stop without losing momentum. She described the sensation of being seen by something that couldn't speak back. She gave the stone no title. She gave the wind no origin. She simply recorded the way they existed beside her. She stayed in that place as the sun made its long arc above her. Shadows stretched from the base of the stone, first long and thin, then slowly retreating as the day turned. Time didn't slip by unnoticed, but it wasn't tracked either. She felt it pass, like weather, subtle, natural, and without demand. Eventually, when the warmth of the day began to wane and the sky took on deeper tones of amber and blue, she closed the journal. She didn't rush to stand. There was no internal countdown, only the quiet signal of readiness that rose from somewhere within. She looked at the stone one last time, not to commit it to memory, but to thank it for holding the space. Then she rose, not lighter, not heavier, just whole. And as she began to walk once more through the tall grass, she didn't wonder what she might find next, because for the first time, she understood that her journey wasn't about discovery at all. It was about returning to herself, one silent step at a time. The terrain began to shift again as she continued forward, the thick, golden grass giving way to patchy soil marked by shallow dips, uneven ridges, and clusters of brittle stones. The colors underfoot grew darker, the sun-brushed yellows slowly dissolving into a muted palette of deep greens, worn browns, and the occasional streak of reddish clay. Low shrubs dotted the way, some thorned, others dry to the point of crumbling at the touch. The wind, once soft and even, picked up tiny particles of grit, sending them into brief spirals that glimmered in the light before settling back to earth. The PEKKA instinctively shifted her weight, adjusting her balance not in defense, but to better feel the ground beneath her. She didn't brace for resistance. She simply wanted to meet the terrain as it was. Ahead, she spotted the remains of a fence, old, leaning, and half swallowed by the slow creep of time. Its wooden posts, once firm, were now cracked and gray, many slanted at awkward angles, their bases consumed by earth and root. Thin, rusted wire hung between them, sagging loosely, fragile, and barely connected. Beyond that modest boundary, the land dropped into a shallow basin. Stones littered the floor of the hollow, some smooth, others jagged, and patches of dry moss clung to the cracks like memory, clinging to forgotten corners. No sound intruded, save the hush of the wind moving gently through the bushes. She stepped over the lowest strand of wire with care, entering the basin without hesitation. The space felt untouched by recent life, not abandoned, but held apart. She walked a slow, deliberate circle around the hollow, observing the lay of the land. It wasn't shaped by hands, yet it felt curated by time itself. Her gaze settled on a large, slightly elevated rock, its surface smoother than the rest. She lowered herself onto it, her frame meeting the stone with a solid, comforting weight. For several long moments, she remained still, letting the moment hold her. The shrubs rustled softly in the distance, moved by a breeze too gentle to see. Somewhere far above, a bird called once, sharp and brief, before silence returned. She placed her hands on her knees and closed her eyes, not to rest, not to escape, but to deepen her awareness. With her eyes shut, the hollow revealed itself in other ways. The smell of dry earth, the subtle vibration of insects below ground, the distant rumble of wind crossing stone. Eventually, she opened her eyes and reached for her journal. The worn leather cover felt familiar, grounding. Pages flipped in the breeze, catching briefly before she stilled them with a hand. She chose a blank page not because this moment needed documenting, but because it deserved presence. Her stylus moved in slow arcs, drawing out words that came gently and without pressure. She didn't describe the hollow in detail. Instead, she wrote about the nature of stillness, about places that don't demand notice, yet offer something essential. She paused between lines, letting the silence fill the space between thoughts. Her entries weren't long, but they were whole. They captured not just facts, but feelings. The way the air tasted when it stopped moving, the way the earth sighed beneath her weight, the way time felt different when it wasn't pushing her forward. She sat like that for a long while, content. When the wind shifted again and the light bent toward late afternoon, she gently closed the journal and slid it back into its place. There was nothing to mark here, no monument to her passing, no change made by her presence. And that was, somehow, exactly what this place needed. She stood slowly, brushed a few loose pebbles from her legs, and gave the hollow one final look. There was no need to memorize it. It had already done its work. She stepped carefully over the wire once more, returning to the outer world with the same quiet ease with which she had entered. Not every place in the journey had to leave an imprint. Some simply reminded her she had form, weight, breath. And in the quiet curve of that hollow, she had remembered that her being, just as it was enough. The ground began to rise gradually, lifting her toward a new horizon sculpted by jagged stone, uneven plateaus, and ridges shaped by countless seasons of wind and erosion. Sparse vegetation clung to the rough terrain. Scrub grass, brittle weeds, and clusters of pale, stubborn lichen that held tight to the faces of weathered rock. The light had shifted as well. It came thinner here, more angular, casting elongated shadows across the landscape that looked like old scars carved into the earth's surface. With every step forward, the PEKKA adjusted, not to resist, but to sync with the rhythm of the place. She walked not to chase a destination, and certainly not to flee anything behind her. Her journey was no longer about direction. It was about continuing. As the incline steepened, the sound around her changed. The wind, once a background presence, became a living thing, curling around the stones, pulling at the edges of the cliffs, rising in pitch and falling like breath. There were no birds now, no insect hum, no footsteps but her own. Yet the silence wasn't empty. It was dense, intentional, like the land had chosen to fall quiet just for her arrival. The world wasn't waiting. It was observing. Eventually, she reached the crest of the rise. A long, flat stretch of stone extended from the ridgeline, reaching out over the valley below like a hand. She walked to the edge, her steps slowing as she took in the view. The earth dropped away in rolling lines, deep valleys and fractured slopes dotted with distant trees and the faint shimmer of rivers threading like silver veins. Above, the sky opened wide, layered with blue and streaks of high, fast-moving clouds that traveled as if they had somewhere urgent to be. She didn't need to analyze the geography. She simply stood and absorbed it, letting the scale of the moment press into her without resistance. She sat on the smoothest part of the rock ledge, removing her helmet and placing it beside her. The wind was stronger up here, playful and persistent, tugging at her hair and brushing against her back like it was trying to tell her something she didn't need to hear. She didn't fight it. She leaned into it instead. Her journal came to her hands easily, the leather cover worn and softened by use. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, let the warmth of the stone beneath her seep through her armor, and breathed without thinking. When she did open the journal, she turned to a blank page and scrawled a single word across the top: perspective. Beneath that, she let her thoughts unfold without haste. She wrote about the gift of height, not just the physical elevation, but the emotional clarity that sometimes came only when you allowed yourself to rise above everything else. She wrote about how the wind never asked who she was, and the stone beneath her never questioned her presence. She wrote about being cradled by things that didn't need to hold her to offer their support. Time passed, shadows shifted, stretched, then thinned, as the sun continued its arc across the sky. What began as a scene of sharp clarity softened into gold, the ridge catching the evening light in muted streaks of amber and rust. Patterns formed along the rocks, shapes that reminded her of things she had once buried deep. But instead of weighing her down, they simply lingered, no longer threats, no longer chains. They were memories, and they had a place, but not control. When she finally stood, her joints moved slowly, not from fatigue, but from reverence. She tucked the journal away with care and took one last look over the vast landscape. It wasn't a farewell. It wasn't a closing of anything. It was a pause that had served its purpose. Then she began to descend, following a narrow trail that twisted down the far side of the ridge. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The clarity she had found wouldn't vanish with the view. It had settled into her, quietly, permanently, like light finding its way into stone. As the trail curved downward from the ridge, the terrain began to shift in subtle, forgiving ways. Jagged stone gave way to rounded earth, and the harsh angles of the high places softened into the kind of rolling hills that looked like they had been smoothed over by time itself. Each step she took sank slightly into soil that had been packed by centuries of wind and weather. The wind, too, had changed. Where it had once screamed through mountain gaps, it now whispered low across the valley floor, gentle and consistent, as though exhaling with relief. She moved with unbroken rhythm, her boots brushing against dry tufts of grass and scattered patches of pale pebbles. The silence that met her wasn't one of still tension, but of peace, the kind that settles over a place that has long accepted what it is. It was a hush, earned by time, a landscape that didn't need to declare anything to be understood. The hills unfolded slowly ahead of her, layered in loose folds like carefully draped cloth. They weren't dramatic or imposing, but carried their own quiet dignity. Following the natural dip between two gentle rises, she descended into a shallow valley. The light changed as she did, dimming just slightly, touched by a ceiling of thick clouds gathering above. These weren't storm clouds, but soft and woolen. Moving without hurry, shadows drifted across the earth in long, sweeping arcs. She never looked up. There was no need to read the sky for signs. Whether it rained or not, she belonged to the day. At the valley's heart, she found a dry creek bed winding its way across the land. It was narrow but clearly defined, its banks shaped by years of forgotten flow. Smooth stones lay scattered along its path, each one worn by water long gone. Delicate threads of moss grew between them like veins, still pulsing with a memory of movement. The creek bent around the valley's natural curve like a question etched into the soil. She followed its arc without resistance, curiosity gently leading her. Eventually, the creek bed brought her to a broad stone shelf resting beneath a shallow, sloping bank. It jutted out like a seat crafted by nature, shaped by wind and the slow wash of old water. Without hesitation, she sat. Her armor made a soft metallic sound against the rock, but even that didn't disturb the peace. Around her, the valley opened like a bowl, wide, gentle, and welcoming. She looked out at the hills surrounding her. From this angle, they resembled waves suspended mid-motion. A few sparse trees dotted their tops, their branches bent by decades of wind, but they stood tall and resilient. They didn't reach. They simply remained. That, too, was a kind of strength. She reached into her compartment and retrieved her journal, now thicker than when she began her journey. The leather was softened at the corners. The pages creased where she'd paused longest. A breeze returned, cool and steady. It brushed over her shoulders and down her back, wrapping around her limbs before flowing onward through the valley. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse, quiet but constant. It didn't push. It passed. She opened her journal and let her pen rest for a moment on the blank page. She didn't search for meaning. She didn't try to conjure insight. Instead, she simply let the words come. She wrote about sitting where water once moved, about how the absence of something didn't make a place hollow. Sometimes the shape left behind carried more truth than the thing itself. She wrote about the kind of silence that didn't seek to erase, but to hold. A container for reflection, not a void. The clouds above grew heavier, and soon a single drop of rain landed on her hand. Then another, softer still. She tilted her head back, eyes open, letting the rain meet her without tension. It wasn't cold. It wasn't harsh. It was just another presence. She didn't reach for cover. She stayed where she was, letting the moment deepen. The drizzle grew into a steady rhythm, tapping softly on stone, grass, and armor. She finished her page and closed the journal with care. She stood without rush, the wetness clinging to her like a light layer of cloth. There was no need to escape the weather. It was not an interruption. It was simply a change. She turned from the stone shelf and continued forward, the rain walking with her. Some parts of the path didn't need brightness or clarity. Some were meant to fall around you gently, to soak in without warning, and remind you that renewal isn't always loud. Sometimes it begins with soft water on quiet ground. The rain faded slowly, tapering off as she walked, until only a few lingering drops clung to the curled tips of leaves and to the narrow ridges of her armor. The air felt thick, not with tension, but with a deep, permeating calm. The sky above remained a flat gray, neither threatening nor welcoming, simply neutral, a quiet canvas against the layered scent of damp earth and wet bark. Each step she took pressed softly into the loosened soil, leaving behind a clear mark, like footprints written in a fleeting alphabet understood only by the land itself. There was no reason to hurry. Her steps matched the moment, measured, thoughtful, present. The trail didn't pull her forward, it moved with her. Ahead of her, the open space of the valley began to transition, slowly giving way to the beginnings of a low forest. The trees here were shorter than those she had seen before, twisting, thick-trunked, with wide-reaching roots that stretched across the ground like old fingers holding the soil in place. Their leaves were a dark, velvety green, glistening from recent rain, and each one dripped in its own unhurried rhythm. As she stepped beneath their canopy, the air shifted again. The soft patter of falling droplets replaced the broader hush of open wind. She could hear the forest breathing, steady and slow. She moved through the trees with care, not because the path demanded caution, but because it felt right to do so. Each footfall was placed with gentle intent. The forest didn't feel wild or untouched. It felt tended to, but not by hands. As if the trees and moss and undergrowth had arrived at a quiet agreement long ago about how to exist here together. Moss grew thick up the trunks, its texture plush and deep. The ground beneath her was spongy, giving slightly with each step, springing back when she passed. In the center of the grove, she came upon a large, flat stone partially sunken into the earth. Its surface was wide and worn, covered in patches of moss and faint, weathered grooves that curved like forgotten words in a lost dialect. She lowered herself onto it, her legs stretching forward, her armor making a soft metallic sound as it connected with the stone. The position was not formal, not prepared. It was rest. Honest, needed rest. She sat still for a long time. The light above filtered gently through the leafy canopy, forming patterns on her armor and the ground below. Every so often, a droplet would break loose from a branch overhead and fall, striking her shoulder or the open page of her journal with a soft tap. She didn't move to wipe them away. Her fingers lay curled around her stylus, relaxed. She wasn't trying to document anything. There was nothing here to analyze. Only something to feel. Eventually, her hand began to move. The stylus scratched lightly across the page, forming letters slowly, deliberately. She didn't try to describe the forest. Instead, she wrote about places that offer quiet without expectation. Places that make no demand of you, and in doing so, allow you to hear yourself more clearly. She wrote about hidden sanctuaries, not carved from stone or built from wood, but grown from stillness. She paused between thoughts, not because she struggled for words, but because the space between them mattered. Her writing grew longer, more fluid, until eventually it faded into a final sentence, and she set the journal aside. Her eyes moved upward, into the trees. The clouds overhead had begun to drift apart, letting a shaft of light break through, golden and warm. It reached down through the canopy and landed softly across her hand, resting there without demand or urgency. She didn't move. She didn't meet it with a gesture. She simply let it be. When the light shifted again, she closed the journal, secured it back into her compartment, and rose to her feet. Her armor held drops of rain, streaks of dampness, but she felt no weight, no pull. She stepped forward through the grove, leaving the stone behind. She didn't mark it. She didn't look back. The forest gradually began to open as she continued onward, the dense canopy slowly thinning until the trees stood farther apart, their branches no longer interlocking, but instead allowing shafts of muted light to break through. Each step forward carried her into a softer silence, the kind born not of stillness, but of deep acceptance. The rain had long since passed, but its memory lingered in the air, a subdued freshness mingled with the earthy scent of moss, drying bark, and crushed leaves. Her pace was unhurried. There was no need to rush. Every movement she made was synchronized with the natural rhythm of this quiet place. Not an intrusion, but a temporary harmony. The path began to dip gently, a subtle decline that led her toward something unseen, but gently promised. The forest floor, once tangled with underbrush, grew smoother, covered in short grass and the occasional bed of fallen needles. A narrow ridge formed naturally beneath her feet, guiding her into a wide, soft basin nestled within the trees. Here, the woods gave way to a quiet clearing, an open, gentle space bordered by weathered stumps, overgrown ferns, and patches of wildflowers that swayed in the hush of a breeze. The light filtering through the clouds turned golden, painting the grass in muted tones of warmth. At the heart of the clearing lay the remains of a fallen tree, its trunk wide and flat, split down the middle by time and weather. It lay like a resting place offered without expectation. She approached it and sat down slowly, her weight settling with a soft creak of armor against wood. The surface was cool and slightly damp, a faint trace of rain still clinging to the bark. She didn't mind. She didn't even notice. Her attention wasn't on herself, but on the place around her. She didn't open her journal. Not yet. Instead, she simply sat and looked. Around the perimeter of the clearing were signs of life lived long ago. Footpaths, almost erased by nature, circled its edges. A small arrangement of stones suggested someone, at some point, had made something here. In one corner, a patch of clover overtook the shallow remnants of what might once have been a fire ring. None of it was fresh. None of it was claimed. And yet, none of it felt forgotten. She leaned back slightly, allowing her shoulders to release the quiet tension they'd carried through the morning. A soft wind drifted through the clearing, brushing gently across her face and stirring the fine strands of hair that had fallen loose. Birds chirped somewhere high in the canopy beyond, their calls brief and scattered, like a conversation she was allowed to overhear but not interpret. The sky above was still painted in a soft veil of gray, but the light beneath it glowed, tender and unhurried. When her fingers finally moved to her journal, it was not from habit, but from a deeper instinct. She opened it to a clean page and stared at the lines for a long while. There was no need to rush words. The quiet was doing its work without help. And still, when she began to write, her hand moved with care. She didn't write about the forest, not directly. She didn't name the fallen tree or describe the clouded sky. Instead, she wrote about what it felt like to not be needed, to sit in a space that expected nothing of her and gave everything in return. She wrote about presence, the rare kind that finds you when you finally stop searching for anything at all. She wrote about the feeling of time stretching without pressure, of peace arriving not with clarity, but with acceptance. She wrote until the words naturally came to a close, until the page felt full, even if it wasn't. At the bottom of the page, she left a thought, soft, simple, and true. Some spaces ask for nothing, and that is why they give so much. She closed the journal with quiet hands. Her breath had slowed without her noticing. Her armor felt lighter, her pulse steady. She rose from the log slowly, not with weariness but with reverence, as if moving too quickly would erase something fragile. She stood still for a moment, turning to take in the clearing fully one last time. She did not catalog it. She did not imprint it into memory. She let it go. She stepped forward into the trees again. The air shifted around her, lifting a few leaves from the ground and carrying them in graceful spirals across the open grass. They floated without urgency, without purpose, and yet they moved perfectly. The trees became increasingly sparse as she continued her quiet path, leaving the dense heart of the forest behind her. The canopy overhead broke apart, allowing more light to filter through in wide, open strokes. Each shaft of sunlight painted the forest floor in soft gold, highlighting scattered patches of grass and old moss-covered stones. Small glades emerged, natural clearings that looked as though they had waited a long time for someone to notice them. The ground beneath her shifted gradually from soft soil to firmer terrain, sloping upward with patient intention. Her steps grew more deliberate, not from fatigue but from a desire to match the unspoken rhythm of the land. Every dip and rise felt purposeful, as if the earth were speaking in long, drawn-out sentences, and she had finally learned to listen. Behind her, the forest sounds faded into memory. The chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of distant twigs, all replaced by a deeper quiet. The sound of space, itself. The wind whispered now, threading through tall grass with a voice so soft it barely stirred her armor. The trees thinned to the point where they no longer framed her path. They simply watched from a respectful distance. There was no clear trail beneath her feet, yet the terrain unfolded ahead of her as if drawn by intention, gently inviting her forward. The air held a warmth just above the ground, but underneath that comfort was something older, a scent like worn stone and distant rain. She crested a wide, gentle hill, and the landscape shifted once more. A sprawling meadow opened before her, ringed by scattered trees and outcrops of worn rock. In the very center of the space stood a half-buried arch of pale stone, its surface smoothed by time and softened by moss. It leaned slightly, as if bowing to no one in particular. There were no markings on it, no symbols or sigils. It didn't guard a doorway. It didn't divide anything. It was simply there, a remnant, a reminder, a monument to quiet endurance. She approached it not with caution, but with respect, drawn by a recognition deeper than memory. She stopped just short of the arch. She didn't step through. She didn't reach out to touch it. She simply stood there, letting her breath fall into rhythm with the wind that moved gently through the meadow. The grass around her swayed, not with force, but with welcome. She knelt, not to rest, but to lower herself to the ground's level. Her hand went to her journal without hesitation, and the worn cover opened to a blank page. With ease, she wrote about thresholds, not the ones marked by grand entrances or dramatic shifts, but the quiet ones that arrive without warning. She wrote about the subtle transitions that happen while you're still looking in the other direction, the changes that don't begin with decisions but with moments that feel like nothing until they are everything. She didn't write about the arch itself, only what it made her feel, that some things exist simply to remind you that you're capable of crossing over, even if you don't yet know what you're stepping into. Her hand slowed as the page filled. Each word found its place with care. She left space between lines, not for more text, but for silence, for breath, for whatever might come next. She didn't try to summarize what she had written. There was no conclusion waiting. The page didn't need to be closed for the moment to be complete. She stood again, brushing her fingers lightly against the moss-covered stone beside her. Not the arch, just the ground. She turned to look once more, not at the monument, but at the entire meadow. The way the wind played through it, the way it didn't need her presence to feel full, the way it allowed her to belong without ever holding on to her. The meadow faded behind her like a chapter ending in silence, its soft grasses parting with no resistance as she stepped beyond the reach of the arch and into newer terrain. The land shifted once again, subtly at first. Low swells of earth rolled beneath her boots, covered in patchy green, then growing steadily more defined. Shrubs appeared along the horizon, and beyond them, she caught the shimmer of distant water. The sky had cleared almost without notice, and above her stretched a pale canvas of calm blue, carrying the promise of something wide, something waiting. The path didn't return. There were no lines in the earth to follow, only feeling, and that was enough. The wind traveled with her now, no longer brushing at her sides, but moving alongside her, familiar, like a quiet companion with no need for words. Her hands were relaxed, her pace unbroken. As she walked, the terrain opened into a low plateau, flat and vast, broken only by the occasional wildflower blooming defiantly from between cracks in the stone. She stepped onto the stone without hesitation. The surface was warm beneath her boots, sun-soaked and solid. She paused near the center, her gaze sweeping across the distant hills, their lines softened by heat and light. She sat, lowering herself with care. There was nothing to lean on, no boundary around her, only open sky and the faint hum of space stretching beyond sight. She removed her helmet and placed it beside her. Her journal rested on her lap, unopened. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she breathed. And as she did, she noticed it, the feeling of arrival, not at a destination, not at an answer, but at a place that no longer needed explanation. The stone beneath her didn't speak. It didn't offer signs or symbols, but it received her. She eventually opened her journal, not out of habit, but out of quiet necessity. Her hand moved slowly as she began to write. She didn't describe the plateau. She didn't try to capture the sky. Instead, she wrote about stillness, not the absence of movement, but the presence of something greater. An understanding that this, too, was part of the journey. Not every step had to lead somewhere. Some steps were the arrival. She finished the page without effort, each word a reflection of the quiet inside her. At the bottom, she wrote one final line. Sometimes, the ground beneath you doesn't change to meet your steps. It waits for you to be still enough to notice it's been holding you all along. She closed the journal and held it in both hands. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath deepened. The wind circled her gently, no longer leading her forward, no longer pulling her back. She didn't stand. Not yet. Some parts of the journey were not meant to be moved through quickly. Some parts were meant to sit with you a while, until both of you were ready to move on together. The wind shifted slightly, brushing her face with a new direction as she finally rose from the sun-warmed stone. The plateau behind her remained still, unchanged by her presence, yet somehow more complete, as if her being there had fulfilled a quiet purpose it had waited for without expectation. Her steps moved forward now, not with urgency, but with the weightless confidence of someone who had left nothing unfinished behind. The landscape ahead sloped down gently, rolling into the distance like the beginning of something unspoken. Every stride felt lighter, freer, as if the earth beneath her was no longer holding her but guiding her. The terrain began to change again with subtle intention. Patches of dry grass grew thinner, replaced by flatter ground laced with scattered stones and thin channels carved long ago by water now gone. These forgotten pathways traced invisible rivers, marking the memory of motion beneath her feet. With every step, she felt the ghosts of those flows. Streams, once rushing, now silent. Stories, once moving, now still. The light above her began to dim as slow-moving clouds gathered, not heavy with storm, but soft, muted, and quieting. The day turned silver, and shadows stretched calmly across the ground. She approached a shallow ridge, its edges framed with jagged rocks dulled and rounded by time. At the top she paused, letting her eyes wander to the land below. Nestled in the fold of the terrain was an old ruin, barely held together, half swallowed by earth and vine. A crumbling wall here, a fractured arch there. Nothing tall or imposing, nothing curated or preserved, but everything about it felt honest, human, something made with intent, used until it was no longer needed, and then simply left to become part of the ground again. She descended the slope slowly, her feet steady between loose stones and curling roots. When she stepped into the heart of the ruins, she didn't search for meaning. She didn't try to read the story in the stone. She walked the space like she would a memory, softly, reverently. A single stone bench stood mostly whole, aged but still holding its shape. Nearby, a circular window with no glass opened upward, framing a piece of sky that looked quieter through its boundary. She sat on the bench, not brushing off the moss or dust. Age was not a thing to be removed. Age belonged. Her armor made a faint sound against the stone as she settled in. For a moment, she just listened. The breeze moved through the broken architecture with a low hum, turning cracks and hollows into gentle instruments. A bird landed on one of the walls, paused, and then flew on. This place did not ask for attention. It simply continued to be. Her journal lay heavy in her lap, its pages filled with more than just words now. She opened it, not to capture, but to continue. Still, she waited a long time before writing. Her fingers held the pen, unmoving. She needed to listen first. The wind, the silence, the texture of the stone under her fingertips. Eventually, the words began to come. Slow, even, thoughtful. She wrote about places that outlive their use, about structures that are allowed to fall, not because they were forgotten, but because they were honored enough not to be forced to remain what they once were. She wrote about dignity in decline, about the beauty in not being rebuilt, about meaning that doesn't need maintenance to exist. She explored the idea that some things are never more truthful than when they are no longer trying to be useful. That remnants are not failures. They are memory embodied. Her writing moved slowly, with long pauses between sentences, not from doubt, but from respect. She filled the page, then added another, letting each thought stretch into full expression. When the last line was complete, she sat back, closing the journal softly and setting it on the stone beside her. Her eyes turned to the open circle above her, the window framing the quiet sky. Light had shifted again, brushing silver across her cheek, illuminating the dust in the air like a soft constellation. She stood, and as she did, a gentle breeze passed through the ruins, lifting the edges of vines and rustling the dry grass between the stones. She walked to the center, not because there was something to see, but because it felt like the right way to say goodbye. The wind caught her hand. She let it. This was not a place to stay. The sky stretched endlessly now, wide and open above her, as the last trace of the ruins fell behind. Her steps carried her over a field kissed by wind, where golden blades of grass bent gently beneath her passing. This place felt different, not sacred, not ancient, but present, alive in its simplicity. It did not carry the weight of memory or the silence of forgotten history. It just was, a place without purpose, except to be passed through. The land flattened completely, and ahead lay a quiet pond, still and perfectly round, nestled into the earth like a mirror that had long accepted its role. Trees circled it loosely, spaced far apart, each one twisted in its own way, grown without guidance, without symmetry. The water held the color of the sky, silver with hints of blue, unbroken, except for the occasional ripple of a breeze, or the soft fall of a drifting leaf. She approached the edge and sat down with her legs crossed, placing her journal beside her for the last time. She didn't reach for it, not immediately. Instead, she let the stillness settle over her like a second skin. There was nothing to name here, nothing to define, only reflection, in the water, in the sky, in herself. Her thoughts, for once, did not come in words. They came in pauses, in breath, in the way her body finally let go of even the softest readiness. No armor to adjust, no future to plan, just now, just presence. The journey she had taken no longer felt like a line. It felt like a circle, quiet, wide, and whole. When she opened the journal, she turned to the last clean page. It waited with no expectation. Her hand moved slowly, not writing to explain, but to say goodbye. Not to the places or the path, but to the version of herself that began it. The one who sought answers, who moved to find, to understand, to complete. That version had walked all this way to arrive at something that no longer needed to be named. She wrote a single sentence. You do not have to carry everything to be whole. Then she closed the journal and didn't open it again. She held it not as a tool, but as a keepsake. Not of where she'd been, but of who she had become while walking. She stood, stepped to the edge of the pond, and looked at her reflection, not for recognition, but for acceptance. Her face was the same, and it wasn't. She stayed a moment longer, breathing in the silence. Then she turned away, not toward a path, not toward a goal, but into the open, undefined land beyond. There was no destination left, only freedom. And with each step, she did not move towards something. She moved with it. Because sometimes the end of the story isn't the end at all. It's just when you finally realize you've already arrived.